We're going to talk about Dignitas Infinita today, infinite dignity, because on Monday of this week, the Vatican released its much-awaited document, 5 years in the making and signed by Pope Francis. The document seeks to clarify the Church's teachings on issues relating to what it calls the dignity of the human condition. And whilst shoring up the very known and traditional Catholic teaching on war, poverty, abortion, euthanasia, and the death penalty, it also makes clear that no one should be persecuted, imprisoned, or tortured for their sexual orientation, and expresses sadness that some Catholics would even think and act in that way, or Catholic countries. However, the report does go on to say that such things as gender reassignment surgery and surrogate motherhood are grave threats to human dignity. Sex change intervention, says the report, risks threatening the unique dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. Now, on that point alone, the Catholic News Agency reported that Dignitas Infinita addresses growing concerns about so-called gender theory. In the publication The Tablet, the chair of the Irish Bishops' Council for Life, Bishop Kevin Doran, welcomed the report. However, the magazine also quotes Marianne Duddy-Burke from Dignity USA, which campaigns for LGBT plus people, saying, "It is shocking to see gender affirmation treatments classified as the same kind of threats to human dignity as war, impoverishment, human trafficking, and sexual abuse." Well, to discuss Dignitas Infinita and its significance, I'm joined by a panel of experts today and interested parties. We've got Christopher White of NCR, Bob Shine of New Ways Ministry, and the Reverend Sarah Jones. I'll introduce them properly as we go along. But Christopher White, award-winning journalist and Vatican correspondent for National Catholic... I always forget what the R stands for, Christopher. Reporter, okay.
Bravo.
Just put it into context for us then. What are we seeing here from the Vatican? Is it just shoring up what they already say? Is there something new going on here?
Sure. Well, you did a very fine job yourself, Leo, in the introduction of sort of giving some broad brushstrokes. This is a document that was published on Monday after 5 years, as Leo mentioned, that was approved by Pope Francis, and it was sort of signed by its primary author, Cardinal Victor Fernandez, who's the head of the Vatican's doctrinal office. He's a fellow Argentine, like Pope Francis, and was put in that position about a year ago. For about a decade, for this entire papacy, he's kind of been in the background as a papal ghostwriter of sorts. But about a year ago, Pope Francis gave him the top job in the Vatican's doctrinal office, an office that has been, over the centuries, the most powerful of the Vatican departments. This document predates his arrival in that office, and when he arrived, this had already been in the works for about 4 years. And he dedicates about 2 pages of this roughly 20-page document of kind of tracing the history of this document. And we can get into why that might be, that he spends so much time sort of giving the history of it. But what he basically tells us the story of going to the Pope with an earlier draft that focused on more of the, shall we just say, the pelvic issues, what the church has traditionally thought of as sort of abortion, euthanasia, those sort of issues that have been kind of categorized as chief concerns about human dignity. And the Pope really wanted him to expand the scope of this document. And so that's why so many issues, roughly over a dozen issues, are specifically itemized or enumerated in this document as, quote, grave threats to human dignity. So I think the document, in a sense, does 2 things that are a bit new, that maybe surprise people. On one hand, it adds to the number of issues that the church says are serious, grave threats to human dignity. And it talks about other issues that aren't just bioethical issues. So issues like war, migration, human trafficking. Those are the issues that have kind of been seen as signature issues during the Francis papacy. On the other hand, I think it gets a lot of attention, as we've seen in the last few days, because some of the hot button issues that it does raise to the forefront are pelvic issues. are the issues that concern gender reassignment surgery, transgender concerns, gender ideology, as the document calls it. So it both expands the issues, and then it also puts a spotlight on pelvic issues while trying to balance it out at the same time.
We'll come back to those very specific things,
of course.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that we've seen from this papacy some very conciliatory things said, which haven't been said before by any other pope, about gay people in particular. Even saying most recently that, in his opinion, gay couples should receive a blessing from priests, not necessarily in church, but he raised this issue of gay blessing. Is there a sense now, since, as you say, that the word threat is used, threat to dignity, that there's a kind of a rowing back on things that we've said in the past?
Yeah, this is why I think for a lot of people, there was a bit of whiplash on Monday with the document's release, that, how to reconcile the Pope who just a few months after his election, when he was asked about gay priests, said, "Who am I to judge?" to just last December signed this declaration that spoke, that gave priests the ability to bless those in same-sex relationships. I think... Look, it's not my job to sort of put the Pope on the couch and sort of psychoanalyze what's going on here. I think, one of the reasons why we have over the course of this decade-long papacy seen what you describe, Leo, as these conciliatory gestures is because historically the Pope has led with the personal. So he's had no problem in having friends who are openly gay and inviting them into the Vatican, including appointing some of them into, positions of authority in the Vatican. He's invited, transgender people to have lunch with him, and he's formed relationships and been pen pals. And Bob can talk about this in a minute, about this very sort of personal approach that the Pope has had. At the same time, I think it's fair to say, with the exception of fiducia supplicans, the Vatican hasn't done anything under Pope Francis to actually change its doctrinal teaching. And that's why I think many people would say that Monday's document is a doubling down on traditional church teaching that, hasn't changed.
You mentioned Bob Shine, and as I said at the beginning, Bob is the Associate Director of New Ways Ministry. He's also a successful author, and he's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Bob, thanks for joining us. Just before we get into the report, just tell us a little bit about what New Ways Ministry is and what it stands for.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. New Ways Ministry, which was started in 1977 by Catholic Sister Janine Gramick, and a priest, Father Robert Nugent, is a Catholic outreach that works for justice and reconciliation for LGBTQ people, particularly in the church, but also in society, through educational programs, publications, advocacy work, dialogue with church leaders, that sort of thing.
Okay, so I'm guessing then that New Ways is not best pleased by this report.
No, we are not.
Putting it mildly.
You have a correct guess. Yes, I think we feel that it has failed, particularly transgender and non-binary people, terribly. The document is wonderful in its defense of human dignity and the reasons why the church has such a strong defense, both in scripture, in our theological tradition, in our engagement with international human rights. I mean, it's a wonderful rationale. And it highlights real pressing issues in the world. And yet, its treatment of gender identity questions is just really, really poor. It's relying on sort of outdated, sort of a gender essentialism that isn't consistent with what the contemporary sciences and society have come to understand about gender. It does not seem to have engaged, the conversations around gender that are happening in the world today. And I think the most disappointment we have is that it seems that when talking about gender identity and gender affirming transition care, transgender and non-binary people themselves were not consulted. It does not seem that church leaders sat down and said, what are your realities? What is your experience? What does this mean to you? Particularly Catholics, because there are many faithful trans Catholics in the church who, despite all of the negative statements and condemnatory, teachings, remain faithful to God, remain faithful to the church. And those are voices that would have been wonderful to participate in a 5-year-long development. There wasn't time to sit down with the people who would be most affected by this section on gender theory and gender transition.
I can understand why New Ways is going to be cross about this, to put it mildly. You were expecting something, you didn't get it. But I suppose you could also say that the church is really just reaffirming its traditional teaching. There's nothing new here apart from the fact that these are the issues that are around at the moment, and it wants to clarify the situation. Would you see some sense in that the church is just saying this is the teaching of the Catholic Church?
They may say that. I think I would disagree, in the sense that if we look at the question of homosexuality, the homosexuality, as we have a contemporary understanding of it today, didn't really emerge in the social consciousness till the 19th century. It was a new question for the church, and that's what the church took up in the late 20th century, and teachings developed. And in the same way, I think it's true for transgender, non-binary identities. Gender diverse people have existed throughout history and across the world, but the contemporary way that we are understanding and come to understand how we're all gendered, this is a new question. And so we don't have, until this document, clear teaching. We can't say we reaffirm teaching, because we have teachings around gender complementarity and essentialism, but we haven't really, I don't think, reflected enough on the specific question of, say, gender transitions. There wasn't a teaching on that. And we need to do deep reflection and discernment about how the church responds to that question. So in one sense, yes, they're reaffirming some of the general teachings on gender. On the other hand, I think they're being innovative and sloppy in doing so, in speaking to specific questions.
I'm going to bring in Sarah Jones now, the Reverend Sarah Jones, who is vicar of the City Parish of St. John the Baptist in Cardiff. Now, Sarah, you started as a Roman Catholic. I know you're not a Roman Catholic now, but you're a priest, you're a Christian, and I guess you would say that, well, you're part of the universal church. So even though it's not your tradition now, what the Pope says matters. You're also a trans woman. So what do you make of what the Pope has said in this paper?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. Shemai Prenhandar from Cardiff, hello, and good afternoon. Yes, I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. I was very happy Roman Catholic. The fact that I'm a happier Anglican doesn't mean anything in terms of how I feel about the Roman Catholic Church. So I receive all the good things with joy that it gave me as I grew up. In terms of the document, really, I'd echo a lot of what Bob was just saying, and I think it is painfully obvious that they might have met some trans people, but they really didn't engage with them. My particular journey was a deeply spiritual one, because I started off thinking, well, if God had made me some kind of guy, did I have any license to tamper with that? And it took me 9 years from starting questioning seriously to make my gender change. And part of that was trying to do the theology of it. So I think the way that the church there is, or the report is outlining it, really does downplay the spiritual side that most spiritual or religious trans people go through. We really wrestle with this, and it doesn't reflect any of that much at all.
You sound pretty disappointed. I'm not surprised by that.
Well, I'm disappointed, but not in the sense of wanting to have a stick to beat the Roman Catholic Church with. I think one of the really important things, which we can treat as a throwaway line, but it really isn't, is this opening statement about every person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being. And the trouble with trans issues at the moment is you kind of get one sentence into it and it suddenly becomes deeply toxic and really aggressive. And if we're to get anywhere, we have to avoid that. So I'm sort of disappointed, but I'm disappointed more for the reality and for the theology. So the reality is there are things in here which will be fired at trans and non-binary people. There's a phrase here about the temptation, this gender ideology leads to personal self-determination and the age-old temptation to make oneself God. And those kind of charges have been laid at most trans people that I know who are religious. And it's really not the case at all. When I was exploring my gender identity and what that might mean for my religious belief, I went on retreat, and the retreat warden at the place I'm going to talk about was very, very old, was no expert in any of this. And he said to me after a few days, he said, "Sarah," he said, "I know nothing about this really." He said, "But it seems to me what you are is God's gift to you. But what you become is your gift to God." And what he was saying is, don't do anything silly, don't do anything rash, but if you really believe you can be the best person that God wants you to be, you may just have to do this. And I would say after 20 years of being ordained, as much of a life of service as many people in public life, straight or gay or non-binary, cisgendered, whatever, I would say that my identity isn't making myself God. It's saying, how can I bring this, whatever I am, how can I bring this to the service of God and to humanity? So I'm kind of sad that I don't think they did the theology as well as they could, as richly as they could. And I'm kind of sad that some of this will be used as weapons, I think, against.
Well, I was going to ask you that, because you talked about it being a very toxic debate, and on both sides. But presumably, and I'd like to know, how much of that toxicity comes your way? Are you the target of discrimination? And does a report like this, coming from the Vatican, from the Pope, add to all of that, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll take the second bit first. Reports like this definitely add to the toxicity and to the general aggression. I think the thing is, in my experience, there are so many people who don't go to church, of whatever denomination. They don't go to church, but what they hear in the news sphere, or what they pick up in the environment about what bishops say, or what church leaders say, or what the Pope says, kind of sits in their brain, and they use that uncritically to attack people they don't like. So whether it's a Roman Catholic Pope, or a report, or an Anglican bishop, or someone leading a church in Alabama, the things they say have massive impact, even to people who actually only go to church for weddings, funerals, and christenings. So it is really important to get our church statements right, because they're massively influential. In terms of what comes my way by way of abuse, at the moment, I say I'm remarkably lucky. I do get stuff, and it is upsetting. Very occasionally, I've simply sat and cried. Mostly, though, I'm remarkably free of it. I don't think it will last. But just generally, any sort of person who tends to engage on this online, it gets abusive very quickly. And I will say from the get-go that goes for all sides or perspectives of the debate.
Okay.
And we really must do better.
Thank you, Sarah. Bob, let me just come back to you from New Ways Ministry. When you hear Sarah speaking that way, how do you stick within the church? I mean, it sounds like a very flippant question, but you're a committed Catholic. You've already said you're angry with this report. When there appears to be, certainly on the face of it, a doubling down from the Vatican on things, how do you stick with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I've asked myself, and I think a lot of Catholics like me have asked ourselves the same question. I give two parts. One is, I think, having an interior faith and a relationship with God and with Jesus. That's the rock of it, I think, for any Christian. Why I stay Catholic is, many people think that at New Ways we spend our days, fighting bishops and in conflict. And actually, what I get to do 90% of the time is work with pro-LGBTQ Catholics to build up ministries, to do advocacy, to foster dialogue. And that's an incredible thing. And in fact, I think I'm particularly gifted to do the work I do because I get to see how much Catholics in the US and around the world are doing and how supportive so many Catholics are. And the Catholic Church theologically understands the church in several different ways. One is institutional, but another is that the church means the people of God. It means all the faithful. And overwhelmingly in the US and in many places, the faithful are LGBTQ supportive. And I think you can't help but find hope and joy in that community, even despite what, when harmful remarks or poor theology or discriminatory actions are happened. And I think that is part of Christian life, is to believe that there is more than the harm done. It doesn't mitigate how real and painful that harm is, but it Christian faith helps us see that we are going to get beyond that. And so I can't help but stay, because if all the pro-LGBT Catholics go, and I support people following their journey where they need to, but some of us, I think, are called to stay to fix things up, because I will agree with Sarah that what our religious bodies do affects far more than the people within our churches. It affects the world. If I could just add one thing in terms of that, and Dignitas Infinita, the U.S. bishops here have healthcare directives, and Catholic hospitals are a significant portion of our healthcare system here. And the bishops are currently revising those directives, part of which will be addressing gender transition and gender affirming care. And this document is going to fully support them in offering a condemnatory, even a ban on it in Catholic hospitals. 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 patients in the US is treated at a Catholic hospital. So when you talk about gender transitions, reproductive care, all kinds of things that the church either critiques or bans, that's affecting millions and millions of people in the US because of Catholic teaching, who may not be Catholic at all, who aren't Catholic in the majority of cases.
It's interesting you talk about Catholic healthcare, because today we've had published in the UK the CAS review, which has basically said that within this kind of toxic debate at the moment, the care is not good, particularly for children in transgender care. It's interesting that report's come out today. And as I was saying to Sarah, there is, and as she acknowledges on both sides, a very kind of toxic reaction to all of this. But I'll come back to you, Sarah, on that point in just a moment. But Chris, let me just ask you something. You mentioned Cardinal Fernandez, who, in a way, fellow Argentine, friend of the Pope, kind of his ghostwriter behind the scenes. He actually emphasized, I suppose we should fairly say, that the church should be and must be in constant dialogue with the world to almost redefine its cultural understanding. He's gone on record as saying that. Is that, in a way, do you think, trying to offer an olive branch to those people who are understandably upset by this report? Almost saying, just hang on. The church is always like 50 years behind, coming up, catching up. Is there something in that, or am I just reading into that?
Yeah, I think that's one read that's perhaps very fair. I mean, the language that you just mentioned of him talking about the need for the church to be in dialogue is not found as much in the document itself as it came from the press conference on Monday when the Vatican officially rolled out the document. And he cited a few examples. One, he talked about sort of the recent 2018, 2019 update to the Catholic Catechism that declared the death penalty to be inadmissible. But then he also cited, the Pope's recent comments about the decriminalization of homosexuality, and he talked about how it pained him to recently read reports of Catholics supporting criminalization. So I think those were his two examples of talking about the church learning and evolving. The interesting backdrop to all of this, I have to say, is right now the Catholic Church is undergoing this tremendous years-long synod process, this listening process where it's invited Catholics from all over the world to talk about their hopes and their dreams and fears for the Catholic Church. And it's provided a forum for, Catholics of all different backgrounds to sort of bring their own experiences to the table. It's interesting, just from my vantage point as a reporter, that while this process is still going on, of the synod process that will conclude in Rome next October, you've had two major documents come out from the Vatican's doctrinal office, one last December and this one this week, that have been quite bold and definitive in their declarations, that are perhaps, they have been open to the criticism that they themselves have not been consultative and they have not sort of taken account of the experience of the synod, which is trying to provide a forum for listening. And I think that's just just the timing of it itself is quite interesting, that these documents are coming out in the interim period before the synod has concluded and this listening has concluded as well. And to Bob's point, talking about the consultation that was involved, I think there are those that are supportive of this document that have criticized in the past few days the fact that there isn't necessarily a deep pastoral dimension to the text, that it doesn't sort of provide the space for pastors in their own sort of pastoral work and their pastoral theology to sort of navigate these issues.
I'm just thinking now, and it's probably the wrong analogy entirely, but this expectancy from the laity, and you're talking now about the synod process, which we haven't had before in the Catholic Church. But I'm thinking back to, was it 1968 when we had Humanae Vitae, which was concerned with birth control? And I think just about every Catholic in the world that I knew, which is very narrow, obviously, was expecting some kind of pronouncement that would endorse the use of birth control. And then all of a sudden the church backtracks. Is there this kind of sense of history always repeats itself? The point I was making to Bob and Sarah, that the church goes so far and then thinks, oh my God, we've got to row back on this. We've gone as far as we can. We said a few nice things, but now we've got to come back to traditional teaching. And as I said to Bob, isn't that just what the church does? Should we be surprised?
I think I said earlier, that you haven't seen any significant doctrinal shifts under Francis. What has changed, I think, is just the tenor of things in Rome. And let me give you an example. About a year ago, I was at a conference. It was an official Vatican-sponsored conference here in Rome by the Dicastery for Integral Human Development, so that the office that deals with peace and justice type issues. And the conference took place. It was a day-long seminar, and they had invited theologians from all over the globe to present their findings, talking to sort of real-life Catholics in the pews. And what the findings that these theologians presented really challenged the church's teaching on questions like women's ordination, the way the church deals with migrants, the way the church deals with LGBT inclusion in the church. And to me afterwards, just reflecting on it as a reporter, the fact that this was a Vatican-sponsored conference where on the front row you had officials from the Vatican's doctrinal office and other Vatican offices, these theologians were invited to present these findings, their conclusions that did officially challenge church teaching in certain areas. I would say that has been the major shift in the last 10 years of the Francis era, that there has been this invitation to dialogue with those that there's been where there is disagreement. So does the church change? I mean, of course, you can point to 1,000 areas where the church has changed. But the change we've seen under the Francis papacy has not been about doctrine. I think it's been about the manner in which these things have been discussed.
Okay. Sarah, let me bring you back in again. I mean, as we explained at the beginning, you're part of the Church of Wales, that tradition that is within the universal church, but is a very separate tradition. There are similar issues going on in your church too, aren't there? I mean, in terms of how the world itself is divided, particularly from the global south, and a kind of a pushback. And there are things that your church are equally struggling with, and sometimes say things that I'm sure you don't agree with at all.
Well, I think, in fact, the church in Wales is remarkably good on matters of sexuality now and identity. So all the bishops of the church in Wales have said unequivocally that we should ban conversion therapy and that it is not good stuff because it isn't therapy. They've said unconditionally that they support LGBTQ plus people. And in fact, in some ways, they're a little ahead of, the Church of England into which I was ordained. I mean, that played no part in me moving from one to another. It was simply there was a parish that felt like it was a me-shaped hole, and off I went, sort of thing. And in fact, they've been very good with me when I arrived. They said, look, we don't want to hide the fact that you were the first person to be ordained having made a gender change. And I should
have made that point, actually. You were the first person.
Yeah. And so they've been very good. But I think, we've talked about the church being very important. But I think, given that this is a briefing for journalists, I think it's very important also to say that the way that journalists report things, it particularly on controversial issues, and this has become controversial, trans issues has become controversial. The way that journalists report things and media outlets, it has a massive effect on the framing of things. So take the CAS report you mentioned earlier on. Yeah. It made 32 recommendations. Now, hands up, it's only just been published. I haven't read the whole thing.
I haven't yet. I've just seen it come out, yes.
Yeah, and I'm a firm believer that people shouldn't talk in public about things they don't know an awful lot about. So, but it made 32 recommendations. And yet, of course, with limited time on radio programs and with limited space in newspapers, what is often pointed out is stuff about puberty blockers, which is very emotive. And even the neutral things where Cass is making the point that the health service provision for trans kids or gender identity questioning kids is not fit for purpose, somehow gets put over as oh my word, the trans people are at it again, isn't it terrible? So we have to be a little careful, and I'm always staggered by the number of articles about trans people in our daily newsprint media. There are people that run numbers of this, and I'm sure people watching the live stream and on YouTube and on the podcast will know these sources. But it's outstanding. You'd kind of think that the biggest issue facing the Western world at the moment was trans people, rather than all the other things that we know are massive issues. So I would want to put a plea in and say the best work from journalists is the careful and nuanced stuff. And we really need you to be doing that, because this is important. Our identity is important. And I get why people who don't encounter trans people are worried about gender changes. I get why people who don't have a family member who's trans are worried about this, because it feels like a big issue. And what would they do if their lovely daughter came out as trans, or their handsome son came out as trans, or their sister? I get why people are worried. And what we really, really need is a little bit more of the nuance and the detail rather than the heat and the noise. And there's a great role to be played here for people who want to do it.
Well, that's a fair point, and I suppose I should say I've focused very much on the trans issue from Dignitas Infinita myself today. But I guess because it's new and it's certainly the church saying something. Question I should say from James Somerville. I'm going to really pronounce your name wrong here, James. I'm so sorry, James Somerville Michael, who is actually the deputy director of the Catholic Union. He said, "Thanks for a good discussion. Interesting to hear about why this document has come out now," which is interesting, isn't it? Because it comes out at a very kind of pivotal moment. As we said, it coincides with the CAS review in the UK and the UK government indicating it will drop plans to ban conversion therapy. Are we seeing something of a shift on this issue in Europe and America? And let me go to Bob from New Ways Ministry. Bob, taking on Sarah's point that we shouldn't just discuss trans issues, although I think it is an important point in this document. On that point about are we seeing a shift? And also the other thing I was going to say, that the big point about this report in Dignitas is that surrogacy comes in for a lot of criticism. And I know for a lot of gay and lesbian couples, gay couples, male gay couples, is that they will use surrogacy to have children. So was that a surprising part and point of this report as well, that surrogacy comes under such criticism?
Yeah, I don't know that I can speak to the UK or to Europe as well. I can speak to the trends in the US. I think when you look at political actors, the right wing has been trying to find wedge issues for years to distract from economic or foreign policy policies that might be unpopular with most people, and so they find something like first it was marriage equality. First it was gay non-discrimination laws. Then it was marriage equality. Marriage equality in the U.S. sort of failed. Most people are on board with it. So then they found trans people, and they said, well, as Sarah said, now trans people are this great threat. And I think why it's effective, and I think why it causes such consternation and why people are sort of moving about is, if you talk about something like war or migration, living in the U.S., I'm not experiencing war. I myself am not a migrant. I'm not, afflicted by human trafficking, these other issues. But gender and sexuality, everyone has a gender identity. Everyone has a sexual identity. And these are some of the most core, intimate parts of ourselves. And I think one of the things that gets lost is, it's not just trans people who think about their gender. Cisgender, non-trans folks, we may not be as explicitly thinking about our gender, but we live and inhabit and perform in gendered ways throughout society. I'm a cis male. There are certain things about masculinity that I was just raised into. And unless I do the conscious work of thinking, is that authentic to me? Is that a way I want to be in the world? Is that a healthy way to be in relationship? I just go on living. These are the most intimate parts. And so I think what the growing consciousness around trans and non-binary identities does is it causes people, and this is the same thing with, I think, gay, lesbian, bisexual people, it causes people who are who are not LGBTQ to have to maybe question things about themselves. It's so intimate that I think that's why you get this emotive reaction. And the same thing for reproductive issues, right? Whether it's surrogacy or abortion or contraception, all of it, these things are the most private parts of ourselves and so core to our identity and so contentious in our personal lives that I think that's why they have such play when people want to exploit them for political purposes, because they touch a nerve in a way that other justice issues that you're not personally affected by, you may care, you may have empathy, but it doesn't go to the core of who you are. And LGBTQ issues, they affect far more than LGBTQ people.
I should have said, thank you, Bob, that James is actually in Vision. I didn't realize that he was there. Did you want to add anything yourself, James, if you want to just come on for a second?
Thank you, Leo. No, that was very well put, that this document comes at the same week that we had the Castro review today, government saying it will drop conversion therapy plans. So is this the start of a shift? And also in terms of whether there's any reason why it's all happening this week. I don't know whether it's just sort of get it out of the way of the synod meeting in October or anything like that. I don't know. Chris might have some view in terms of the timing as part of broader Vatican politics. I don't know.
Well, let's put that to Chris, but also Tim Wyatt. I think you had a question. If you can hear me, Tim, if you want to come in and particularly ask the question yourself.
I'm very ignorant of internal Catholic politics. It's not my area, but I just think it's really interesting that clearly the fiducia supplicans in December was I guess the Vatican would say it wasn't changing doctrine, but it was kind of opening up pastoral opportunities for priests to offer blessings for the first time for gay couples. And now this seems to kind of double down and be a kind of strong restatement of existing, more conservative teaching. Are those two in tension? Is it a deliberate attempt to try and reassure conservatives that don't worry, the Pope hasn't gone soft on this issue, we still stand strong, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we saw after Fiducia Supplicans, which is the Vatican Doctrinal Office's document that allowed for gay blessings, we saw tremendous fallout in Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the Vatican's Doctrinal Office, said after that, which I think is maybe a bit revealing, he said, effectively, don't worry, in a few months' time, we'll be releasing this document on human dignity, and that will make those more conservative-leaning Catholics happy. So, those were his own words. And so I think you do get a sense that they are trying to find some balance. That being said, I also think, just as a reporter, I think it's important to note, this is a document about human dignity. It's over 12,000 words long. The paragraphs dealing with sort of sex and gender are about, I think, 5 or 6 paragraphs, roughly around 1,000 words. So that is the lead story that's come from this. That is not what the text dedicates most of its attention to. And I think that is why you get this introduction from Cardinal Fernandez that I referenced earlier, that's 2 pages long, and him specifically quoting the Pope's request that they balance out the issues and talk about war, justice, human trafficking as the range of issues that the church is engaged on, not just public issues.
Okay, I guess we should point out, shouldn't we? Because as I said before, we have debated this sexuality issue, but this document is very strong on condemning certain actions towards migrants. It reaffirms its position on the death penalty, as you were saying earlier, etc. So I guess it's a kind of a review of 2 halves, isn't it? Would you say, Chris?
I think that's a fair summation, yes, and I think. Pope Francis, in the very first interview he gave as Pope in 2013, made headlines for saying, Catholics can't talk only about issues like abortion and gay marriage. So I think what we have seen is him try to bring other issues and elevate them. I think it's fair to say that Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, really did feel the need to double down on issues regarding marriage, sex, and family life. And what we've seen with Francis is a shift away from that. This document, of course, touches all of those issues. So.
Okay, but let me come to Bob again now, as we sort of draw to a close in a way. Where do we go now? Where does New Ways Ministry go now? What do you say to your people, the people that you've been supporting and advocating for? It's like this has kind of landed at a time, as James was saying, when all sorts of political debate is going on. As Sarah said, it's a very toxic debate. What do you say to your people now? Where do we go from here?
This morning on our website, we published testimonies from 9 trans or non-binary Catholics or pastoral ministers, family members, simple people. And so I just want to, where do we go from here? I'll draw from the responses we gathered from that, which is, several of the trans Catholics said, look, the church changes. I'm here. I think Pope Francis and Cardinal Fernandez are both dialogically oriented people. And so where do we go? Well, this is a negative moment in the institutional church's relationship with the LGBTQ community. It is not a final moment. And many Catholics, LGBTQ and ally, will continue to do ministries in their parishes and schools. The document does not at all say that we should curtail the pastoral work that's being done with trans Catholics. It does not put any limitations on the kind of outreach and spiritual direction and different facets of being part of the church life. There are no limits on that. So I think many Catholics will just keep doing what we're doing, knowing that this is there, but that there have been harmful documents before, harmful statements before, and we've pressed on. And so a lot of the trans Catholics that we published this morning said, look, we're here, we're waiting. When you're ready to talk, we have a lot of gifts and insights and wisdom and contributions to give to the church. And my hope and New Way's work will be dedicated to continue to open those channels of dialogue and further them and educate and hopefully bring. And the fundamental flaw, I think, on gender in the document is it just has not engaged both lived experience and contemporary science. So the work now is to engage church leaders and say, this is really what's going on with trans and non-binary people. As Sarah said, it's not a choice. It's the type of journey that is a long discernment with consultation. And on the specific question of medical transition, we need to educate church leaders about what actually goes on there. It's not a willy-nilly decision, and a lot of the common understandings around that kind of medical care are just really bogus for many people that just don't understand. Our work is to educate, and that is a spiritual work of mercy. Educating people who may not know something about something is one of the mandates of Christian life. And so that's where we go from here. We just keep educating and dialoguing and supporting and inviting people and the church to be more faithful to the gospel ideals that we profess.
And Sarah, a similar question for you in Wales. I was really struck by what you said about to read the newspapers, to look at Twitter and other kind of social media. You'd think that this was the only issue that is important at the moment in terms of trans issues, but nevertheless, it is an important issue. I just wonder from your point of view, and you said also that when leaders speak like this, it really matters. It has an effect. So where do you think that we go from here?
I think, like Bob, the big work now is a broader educational thing, because to be right, we do need to get this right, and we do need to understand, and try and put our whole lives in the context of what we believe about God. It's important work. So I think there is a strand of work to say, look, real trans people exist, and if you want to know about our stories, and if you want to broaden your approach to things, let's do the real work and let's do it decently without demonizing people. But I also think that this document speaks very much to everybody's identity and role in life, because despite the fact it talks about gender ideology as if it comes from trans people, it has its own gender ideology, which is worth unwrapping. It talks about biological sex and the socio-cultural role of sex. sex can't be distinguished. Well, what does that say about women's lives and men's lives? And I think it would be great to explore what it is to be a man in today's society or a woman in today's society as well. This encompasses us all. And I think it's a fruitful area for talking through. From my point of view, I'd want to make sure that there's a massive emphasis on de-escalating everything and getting to the real heart of the problem without it suddenly becoming some kind of shouting match, really. And there is almost no one doing that at the moment, because as soon as someone tries it, someone else then weighs in on them and the fight has started, even if the original person, didn't want to fight. So we got to set a new pattern. But I think there's a lot of interest in it out there. And I think people would engage if it was done in the right way.
Sarah, thank you. Let me come for a final word to Chris White, in the Vatican correspondent for RMC. We talked about Cardinal Fernandez, who's the Pope's right-hand guy. He offered, as you said, maybe some kind of an olive branch to the way that the church may react in the future. But let's end on this idea that, Pope Francis is elderly now. He's not in good health. People describe him a bit like they used to describe Pope John Paul II as a guy in a hurry, trying to get things sorted out before he leaves us. So where do you think we go next? Is this the Pope saying, let's get it all out there on the table? This is what I think. This is what I'm leaving as my legacy. Where is this going next?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. He's an 87-year-old Pope. He's often joked to those that are close to him that when the end is near, when you're approaching the finish line, you have to sprint. I think he's invested a lot in this project of synodality to make the church more capable of listening to all of its members. That hasn't, certainly been lived out fully. I think it's very much a work in progress. I think he's very comfortable with messiness and ambiguity and putting these things all on the table for debate. I think that debate will very much be alive when he does pass, whenever that time is. And the next conclave to elect who succeeds him will probably be a referendum on that.
Chris, thank you very much. In fact, thank you to Chris, you, and also to Sarah and to Bob and to all of you for listening today to our podcast here from the Religion Media Centre. Don't forget, if you go to our website, religionmediacentre.org, you can sign up for our daily newsletter and all of the other issues that we try and bring to you across the week and across the year. But for the moment, thank you very much indeed.